Hello, welcome to the first event in the Tax Justice Network's webinar series, the Tax Justice Series 2022, an urgent year for global action. Before we get going, let me advise you that we have interpretation available to English, Spanish, and French. The speakers in this session will be speaking in English and in Spanish. So to listen in your preferred language, please just click the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen and select the language that you'd like to follow in. The reason we put together this event series, and this is instead of our long-standing annual conference this year, is because we feel there are just a set of key opportunities in tax justice this year. And we wanted to pick them out in a different a different event for each one. These include an opportunity around the idea of a global asset register, bringing together public registers of the ultimate beneficial owners of companies and all other legal vehicles and high-value assets, starting to give us the kind of transparency of wealth internationally that we need, but also around the UN Tax Convention, an instrument that could really radically change the way that we make the tax and transparency rules towards something much more globally inclusive than the current arrangements. We feel this is the year of opportunity. And so the further event series will go through these, but I'm sure we'll also talk about them today. Today, however, we are here for the launch of the Financial Secrecy Index 2022, ranking an industry of lawless wealth. Now, the index has been published every 2 years, more or less, since 2009. And it's the leading global ranking of secrecy jurisdictions, the countries and territories that offer financial opacity for non-residents to exploit, whether that's for tax abuse, for corruption, other illicit financial flows, including relevantly in today's political news, including the evasion of sanctions. Now, the role of the index, in a sense, is to show both for individual countries, but also globally, the progress that we're making or failing to make on financial transparency. Since 2015, the world has had an agreed global target as part of the UN Sustainable Development Goals to reduce the level of illicit financial flows. And of course, illicit financial flows cover a range of types of largely bad activity, bad in different dimensions. But the common feature to all of them, whether they're tax abusive or other forms of corruption or about the theft of public assets, the common feature is that they are hidden. And so they rely on financial secrecy to go undetected and unchallenged. So the Financial Secrecy Index gives us a way of assessing both the global progress and the relative threats that different countries and jurisdictions pose in terms of illicit financial flows affecting other countries. And the index, as we'll hear shortly from the leading expert, combines two different dimensions. One, a set of measures of secrecy, and the other, a measure of how important each jurisdiction is in terms of the global provision of financial services. And it's that combination of secrecy and scale that tells you who the big threats are. We're not just interested in very secretive, but almost insignificant actors. We want to know who the big players are, the big threats. And that's what the index gets at. Now, we have this moment in international politics where, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the major countries, particularly the G7 group of countries, have committed themselves once again to imposing sanctions. But of course, as the index will reveal, the G7 countries themselves are responsible for a great deal of the financial secrecy that makes not only sanctions, but also all sorts of other countermeasures against illicit flows ineffective. And what we need to see, and we hope this is an opportunity this year, is a recognition of the damage that allowing anonymous wealth, anonymous ownership does, and a real consensus to change the approach to financial secrecy and bring in the type of policy measures that are very well established, but just not yet fully delivered. So In order to go through this today and talk about some of these issues in more detail, and talk about the way that they act in different regions of the world too, we have a great panel with us. First of all, we'll hear from Moran Harari, who is the Interim Director for Financial Secrecy with us here at the Tax Justice Network, and has led this year's index, the entire process of creation with a great team behind her. Then on the panel, we have Carla Mera, who is the Director General of the Financial and Economic Analysis Unit of the Government of Ecuador. So a country that well used to dealing with problems of financial secrecy posed by other jurisdictions, and will really get a practitioner's view of how that secrecy can impact and the type of measures that you can take against it. Then we'll hear from Matti Kohonen, who is the director of the Financial Transparency Coalition, of which the Tax Justice Network is proud to be a member. Matti, of course, was once of this parish also, and now leads the coalition that is really the set of global actors working on financial transparency issues. Then we'll hear from Irene Ovunji-Odida, who's a commissioner at the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation, ICRIT, has also been a member of the high-level FACTI panel, which of course last year produced its final report, laying out a whole set of recommendations, key recommendations for the overhaul of the international financial and tax architecture. And last but not least, we'll hear from Juan Carlos Otero, who's the president of the Financial Information Unit of Argentina, again offering a practical view about the ways that financial secrecy poses challenges and the types of measures that can be taken against that, and perhaps thinking about the type of role that the Financial Secrecy Index and this type of analysis of individual elements of secrecy can bring us. Now, throughout, I will encourage you all to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask any questions to the panelists. After the set of presentations, Moran will take around 15 minutes, and then each of the panelists will have 5 to 7 minutes. We'll then go into 20 to 30 minutes of a Q&A. So please do start putting your questions in, and we'll pick up those that we can in the discussion afterwards. Okay, with that, let me hand over to Moran Harari, as I say, the Interim Director for Financial Secrecy with us at the Tax Justice Network, who can really set out what the Financial Secrecy Index is and what the results are telling us this year in 2022. Moran, please.
Thank you, Alex, and hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be in this moment where we're launching the Financial Secrecy Index finally. I will share my screen. Yeah, all good. Okay, so let me take you through the index. So the Financial Secrecy Index is actually a great tool for understanding global financial secrecy and illicit financial flows. Now, as Alex mentioned before, at the Tax Justice Network, we publish it every 2 years since 2009, and this is already the 7th edition of it. And we started with assessing 60 jurisdictions, and every edition we try to increase the number of countries we assess. So for this 2022 edition, we already assess 141 jurisdictions. The index ranks jurisdiction based on how much financial secrecy they supply to the world. So a higher rank on the index does not necessarily mean that a country is more secretive. Rather, that a country plays a bigger role in enabling individuals and entities to hide and launder money. And the index, as you can see, has 2 components, one qualitative and one quantitative. So the secrecy score, which is the qualitative component, assesses how secretive the country's legal framework is. The quantitative component is the global scale weight, which is the country's share in the global financial services that are offered to non-residents. And the combination of these 2 components, according to a specific formula, leads to a secrecy value, according to which we rank the jurisdiction. Now, the reason why we take into account the global scale weight and not just rank them according to their legal framework is because we measure the risks of illicit financial flows. And it's clear that large financial centers with relatively moderate financial secrecy, like Luxembourg, for instance, they facilitate more illicit financial flows than small financial centers with high level of financial secrecy, like the Maldives. So that's where we see we can have more impact in changing and pushing those countries to change their rules. Now, in our view, the bigger financial center is, the more responsibility it has to be financially transparent. So, as Alex said, the index is not just a binary blacklist or whitelist of countries. It is rather a spectrum. We reflect it on a spectrum which all jurisdictions are scored according to the extent of the financial secrecy they supply. So the secrecy score component is comprised of arithmetic average of 20 secrecy indicators divided to 4 thematic areas. And they are all scored between 0 to 100. Among others, we look at ownership registration of legal vehicles like companies, trust, and so on. We look at information exchange, court secrecy, bank secrecy, and more. And we assess each one of the secrecy indicators according to the weakest link principle. And what does it mean? That the least transparent option available in the jurisdiction will be the one to determine the indicator secrecy score. So, for example, if a country has several types of companies, just one of which is not obliged to register its legal owners, most likely it will score badly on the specific indicator, because we assume that those that want to abuse the system will choose exactly to incorporate that type of company. So we launched the index this morning, and this is kind of a taste of our recent media hits so far. So as you can see, it's kind of from many countries, many languages, and we hope it will increase in the next few days and bring more impact. And the results. So as you see here, the US now ranks first on the index. It has climbed to the top of the ranking by enabling the biggest supply of the financial secrecy ever recorded by the index. One of the most harmful factors behind the US position is actually refusal to reciprocally exchange information with other countries' tax authorities. Germany moved up from 14th, it was in 2020, and now it's ranked 7th after it increased its supply of financial secrecy by 36%. Singapore leapfrogged from the 5th it was to the 3rd place this time after it increased its supply of financial secrecy by 14%, while Hong Kong was slightly reduced. And the United Arab Emirates went up from the 10th to the 8th after increasing its supply of financial secrecy by 7%. Now, the United Kingdom is not here in the top 10. It's ranked 13 this year. But the UK, if we add the UK and its overseas territories and crown dependencies together, they actually supply just over 10% of the financial secrecy in the world, which is almost double the one of the United States supply. So some global observations from this edition. Overall, the global financial secrecy supplied by countries was reduced by 2%. So that really confirms that the transparency reform we are seeing in the last recent years are working. The reduction is primarily driven by 2 trends. First one is that more countries are adopting or improving beneficial ownership registration laws. And the second is that more countries, particularly lower income countries, improving international cooperation on anti-money laundering, on information and exchange, and judicial cooperation. So if we compare the jurisdiction performance on the ABC of transparency, as we call it, so A is for automatic information exchange, and B is for beneficial ownership, and C is for country-by-country reporting, we definitely see improvements there compared to the 2020 edition, and I will say some more about that in a minute. However, 5 of the G7 countries, namely the US, Germany, Japan, the UK and Italy, have cut back that global progress by half. So these 5 countries collectively supply 1/8 of financial secrecy to the world. And when I say cut by half, it means that if we exclude the increase in financial secrecy of these countries, we find that global financial secrecy actually is reduced by 5% rather than 2%. If we slightly dive into the trends on our ABC of transparency, so with regards to automatic information exchange compared to the 2020 edition, 5 additional countries, basically Brunei, Kenya, Morocco, Maldives, and Peru, have joined the common reporting standard, and they exchange bank account information automatically now. The second thing that worth mentioning is that after almost 5 years, we have been calling for countries to publish some statistic on the data they have been exchanging. 2 countries, Australia and Germany, are finally publishing statistic on an aggregate basis. And actually, just last week, Argentina joined these 2 countries and published this type of statistics as well. However, many low-income countries are still left out and are not able to join the multilateral convention for various reasons. So we still need to push for inclusivity here. And until that happens, it will surely help if more or even all countries that are already part to that convention will publish the statistics, so that the data they can exchange can be used to by other countries that are not yet there to identify important trends. On beneficial ownership registration, compared with the 2020 edition, where we identified 80 countries that have beneficial ownership registration, this time around, we are already identifying 92 countries, and we expect this trend to continue to grow in light of the recent FATF reform of Recommendation 24, which requires beneficial ownership registration of legal persons to be made with an authority. Nonetheless, improvement is still required. So some of the laws have loopholes, and we detail them in our country profiles, as you can see on our website, and thus they are not likely to lead to this sufficient beneficial ownership registration as we would like them to. Second, the scope of many of the laws is limited, and often it covers only legal person, but not trust or limited partnerships. And the third thing we should say that many beneficial ownership registration are unfortunately not publicly available. On country-by-country reporting, since 2020 edition, Switzerland joined the countries that require companies operating in the extractive sector to publish their country-by-country reports. So we have 1 more country at the moment. Also, in 2021, there were 38 countries that have published statistic on their implementation of Action 13 of the OECD, which requires companies to report on country-by-country reporting, but this is not made public. So while this statistic, again, are anonymized and on an aggregate basis, they are still useful and they constitute a useful step forward. But still, there is no country in the world at the moment that requires public country-by-country for all sectors. So the available sectors are either extractives or the banking sector. So what can we do about this? Global asset registry. So anonymous wealth, as Alex mentioned, is inevitably lawless. And Therefore, it's important that countries will set up global asset registry to deliver transparency of ownership and to allow laws and taxes to be made fair and effective around the world. Second, our recommendation, we have to push for the UN Tax Convention to set the standards in a globally inclusive way and to create an intergovernmental rule-setting body that can deliver the tax rule to end the global tax abuse and cost countries almost $500 billion in lost revenues every year. Now, we have the momentum, the momentum to move rulemaking to the global tax and finance to the UN was already triggered in 2020 by the UN FACTI panel, which recommended to establish a UN tax convention. And in 2021, it was the World Economic Forum that recommended it as a key policy pathway. And recently also the African Union discussed it. So we definitely have to push for that. And finally, our index is definitely not just a ranking. We have a brand new website that we really invite you all to have a look at it and to explore. We have methodology and research reports there available. We have a country profile for each of the countries we assess, very detailed with all the sub-indicators there, explanations, sources, and much more actually. So you're all welcome to visit there. And I'm happy to answer any question you may have. Thank you for listening.
So I will ask Matti Kohonen, the director of the Financial Transparency Coalition, if he can speak first on the panel, talking about the work of the Financial Transparency Coalition and its role and membership in driving forward global progress. And perhaps, Matti, your reflections on the index, whether we should feel optimistic or deeply concerned about the direction of travel, and then looking ahead where things need to go from here, and perhaps particularly in this urgent year of action. So, Matti, over to you.
Thank you, Alex. Hi, everyone. So the Financial Transparency Coalition really is a global coalition of a membership of 11 members in each continent, the majority of whom in the global south. And we really advocate for the ABC of financial transparency as a solution to the crisis of financial transparency that creates further crises, that creates lost revenues, that enables kleptocracy, and that prevents the financial system from working for the benefit of everyone in enabling sustainable development, enabling the realization of human rights, and tackling environmental crimes. So that, in brief, is our mission. We really do work on the ABC, as Moran described them, the automatic exchange of information between countries. So if you have a bank account or if you have an asset in another country, that it could be submitted back to your country of residency. That's important so that we can tax offshore wealth. We work on the beneficial ownership transparency, and we prefer public beneficial ownership transparency. So FATF still have a way to go in promoting public beneficial ownership registries, and they will enable anyone to see who owns what. And ideally, you don't just have the company behind the next layer, if you like, of the Russian doll, but you have the real human being who owns company shares or trust beneficiaries. And we would furthermore, from a beneficial ownership registry, like to see the threshold to be dropped from the 25% that tends to be the norm in Europe and elsewhere, to a much lower threshold level, like we've seen in some BO registries. I remember in Ghana, there's no threshold for politically exposed persons, and there's a lower threshold for extractive industries. I think that sets a very good example of how the Global South can lead the debate on beneficial ownership transparency. On country-by-country reporting, again, that has really moved too slowly. We've seen a resolution in the European Union this year on country-by-country reporting, but it didn't deliver real country-by-country reporting. It delivered country-by-country reporting on EU territories themselves, and then a few territories or countries that the EU designated as being high risk. So the progress on that as well is still being stalled. So I think I I can agree with the overall picture of the FSI presenting in all of the areas of secrecy indicators, that we have small steps in improving transparency in some of the areas of the ABC. 2% sounds about right in terms of how much transparency we are seeing and how much we're advancing transparency, but the big players can still get away. And just as an example of how some of the big players can get away, we see how, for instance, the Russian oligarchs, of whom some estimates say there's $1 trillion of offshore assets by wealthy Russians. Not all of those belong to oligarchs, but a large proportion would. And only 17.5 billion assets were found when the OCCRP, an investigative journalist body organization, were looking into Russian oligarch assets in any form of registries or any form of ownership, and the leaks that we've also seen in the last years. And the leaked databases therefore provided. So 17 billion out of $1 trillion is really not enough if you want to find Russian oligarch assets. And in some cases, we can't even find the real owners of big yachts that cost hundreds of millions sitting in docks in Italy or in Hamburg. And we can't understand who owns them. Yet there is a shipping registry. There's the Lloyd's shipping registry. There are other shipping registries, but they don't record the real beneficial owner behind those ships. So, you know, the sanctions become ineffective if even the most emblematic, if you like, assets of yachts can't be found in terms of their ownership. And I would also say that the last year also saw important leaks. Both the Pandora Papers showed that the US indeed has become a leading jurisdiction in terms of providing secrecy. And especially the US state of South Dakota came up as having hundreds of billions of hidden assets in their trust industry. That in itself is a huge risk, and rightly in America, it has been now identified as a national security risk and therefore bumped up on the political agenda. And we hope that that leads to substantial change in tackling those providers of secrecy. And indeed, the enablers is very important. The trust enablers are the law offices, the accountancies, and the sort of banks who provide and host those assets. We also saw the Swiss secrets that looked at the role of Credit Suisse in Switzerland. And if you like, the number 2 on this FSI index this year shows how Switzerland, despite some of the progress made in maybe finding the direct owners of, if you happen to have a Swiss bank account, they still allow for corporates who are based in another jurisdiction to own a bank account. And as long as you use the Russian doll to hide your assets in a few layers, it's still possible to utilize Switzerland as a place to hide assets.
Thanks, Matty. I have a question for you, but I'm going to bring it back after others have spoken. But thank you for that. Now, I think Carla Mera has joined us, the Director General of the Financial and Economic Analysis Unit of Ecuador. So let us go back, if we can, to Senora Mera for her reflections on how financial secrecy affects Ecuador and the kind of steps that that Ecuador is able to take in response. Señora Mera, muchas gracias por estar con nosotros y le doy la palabra.
Antes que agradecer por la invitación y la oportunidad de poder dirigirme a cada uno de ustedes. En abril del 2021, el Ecuador publicó su primera evaluación nacional de riesgos. Como amenazas principales se determinó al narcotráfico, la corrupción, la evasión fiscal, la defraudación aduanera y el robo de vehículos. Además, como amenazas emergentes a los delitos medioambientales y a la trata de personas. Todos esos delitos generados de grandes cantidades de recursos ilícitos tienen como protagonistas a organizaciones delictivas muy arraigadas en el Ecuador y de sus complejas, que buscan por varios medios y utilizando diversos mecanismos estructurar estos activos y esconder su origen de las autoridades nacionales. En el caso de funcionarios públicos corruptos de Ecuador, han venido perfeccionando sus mecanismos para recibir sobornos. Hace algunos años hubo un caso en la construcción de una refinería. Usaron empresas ecuatorianas que pertenecían a sus familiares y empresas constituidas en países de Centroamérica. En el caso de Odebrecht ya usaron esquemas mucho más complejos que fueron develados gracias a la investigación y cooperación de países hermanos. Con la pandemia tuvimos casos de sobreprecios y medicinas e insumos donde se utilizaron empresas que emitieron facturas fantasmas para encubrir los sobreprecios y pagar mínimos impuestos al Estado. En todos estos casos se ha identificado a funcionarios públicos corruptos que identificaron aquellos países, que no compartieron información financiera con otros países y dirigieron los flujos ilícitos hacia esos destinos. Esto ha complicado el trabajo de las autoridades nacionales. En el caso de la UAFE, hemos rastreado los fondos hasta este tipo de jurisdicciones y ante la negativa o falta de respuesta de información financiera, los resultados de los análisis y la identificación completa de la ruta completa del dinero se ha visto afectada ante estas negativas. Los países que se escudan en el secreto financiero para negar información se convierten en el escenario ideal para que organizaciones delictivas y definitivamente que tienen que transparentar y dar acceso a esta información, como siempre menciono, la mejor forma de luchar contra el lavado de activos y sus delitos precedentes es cortando los flujos financieros y recuperando los activos mal habidos en favor del Estado. Agradezco su atención y espero que esta jornada sea de provecho. Buenos días.
Muchas gracias. It's fascinating to hear, you know, the steps that are starting to be taken and how Ecuador has taken a lead in some of that work. We'll, I'm sure, come back in questions. Let me pass on now to Irene Ovonjiodi, the commissioner with ICRICT and a Ugandan lawyer and human and women's rights activist, perhaps to talk about ICRICT's position on these issues, and again, perhaps that question of whether we should be encouraged or worried by what the Financial Secrecy Index is telling us this year. Irene.
Thank you very much, Alex. I'd like to thank the first two speakers for highlighting, in the case of Matti, some of the technicalities around this issue, and Carla for really bringing out the cost and the impact of financial secrecy, and reminding us that the purpose, the objective of those individuals and legal persons who use financial secrecy is nefarious. You know, that there's a real human cost to it. There's a real impact in terms of things like human trafficking and so on. So it's not just a theoretical issue, an academic issue, but has real implications for human rights. And again, for highlighting the kind of political economy that is generated as a result of these sorts of practices. I was asked to talk about tax havens and you know, what do we think about them and how does this connect to the Financial Secrecy Index? My exposure to these issues first came from when I was chair of ActionAid International, and there was a tax justice campaign that ActionAid started up. But much later on, the work with the Mbeki panel and the FACTI panel more recently. And really, tax havens, which are jurisdictions with high levels of financial opacity and low or inexistent tax rates to multinational corporations, to big capital and wealth, are a huge, major negative impact on global financial transparency, which is one of the issues that we were focused on with the FACTI panel in 2020 and 2021, and overall really contribute greatly to undermining global financial transparency and overall integrity of the global financial system. The kind of negative impacts that they generate fall in many different dimensions, and Matti has spoken to some of them as well. For starters, they are a major part of stealing tax revenues of countries where wealth is generated. You know, you have multinationals operating in countries and then shifting their profits out into these havens. Because of the presence of tax havens, we see a shrinking of fiscal space of governments, you know, that because of the reduction in revenues that are urgently needed to finance issues such as in dealing with climate change and financing the urgent energy switch over, issues around COVID, and Carla has talked about that. So COVID vaccination and overall achieving development for countries and you know, meeting the targets of the SDGs. According to the State of Tax Justice 2021, tax havens cause a total loss of revenues globally of around $483 billion US, and this was referenced at the beginning in the introductory segment. And this is largely due to multinational tax abuse and tax evasion of the ultra-rich. When we worked on the Becky panel and we came up with the report in 2015, we found the losses of illicit financial flows to Africa were in the range of 50 to 60 billion per annum. And 65% of those losses came from commercial practices, largely based on tax and trade fraud. So tax havens are an integral part of that, of extracting wealth from countries where these profits are generated, and therefore undermining the ability of countries to raise revenues. They don't only unfairly deprive countries of revenues, which are due from corporate taxes on profits, which is one of the main issues that ICRIC was formed to address, but also from capital income and wealth taxes that could be generated by this hidden undeclared wealth. And so this impedes the consolidation of progressive tax systems and reinforces inequality across the globe. This inequality is increasing between countries, but also within countries. So even in countries, in regions which are advanced and where development objectives have been achieved, we see increasing inequality between ordinary citizens and the wealthy, and tax havens are a major part of this. And this is one of the phenomena you see here in the US, where I'm currently based as well. And we see that the US has risen up on the index. One of the major challenges of tax havens are around in terms of the political economy that they contribute to generating globally is the undermining of democratic principles and promoting the rise of populism that we have seen in the past, in the past few years, re-emerging in many countries, including and perhaps especially in advanced economies. So when you see the rich and the most powerful not paying their fair share of taxes, the social contract that sustains democracies is severely threatened, is severely undermined, and many ordinary people lose trust in public institutions and in governance overall. And so we see ruling elites emerging, and this resulting in phenomena such as state capture. So why is there more urgency now? Why more than ever? And why would the Financial Secrecy Index help? It is important to tax multinationals and the ultra-rich better and more fairly, because this is a chance to contribute to dealing with the effects of climate change. And we know that there is a small window now for dealing with the devastating consequences for humanity. So this window of opportunity can be best addressed through fair taxation. It is also important in the wake of a pandemic, with COVID, which has devastated economies across the world, and particularly in developing countries. So issues like the COVID vaccination in developing countries, which we know was not achieved for many countries, including many in Africa, and contribution generally to public services and finances for that would be made possible by dealing with financial secrecy much more effectively. Overall, the index and the work around tax justice shows very clearly that there is enough wealth, there is enough money in the world to meet the needs of the world, but not the greed of the world. And this wealth, we recall, this wealth which is hidden in havens is generated in a number of countries, including in developing countries. So there is also an issue of unfairness in a system that enables the wealth that's generated through activities in many countries, in developing countries as well, to be extracted through these sorts of mechanisms that the Financial Secrecy Index aims to support governments to address. So it is crucial to follow the money because the loss of revenues due to tax havens weigh more heavily on the accounts of the less privileged. The losses represent 10% of the annual health budgets in industrialized countries, as opposed to 48% in developing countries. So that shows the disparity of impact between those countries that are still developing and those that have advanced economies. So the FSI is crucial to identify the jurisdictions that must be held accountable for these losses by enabling individuals to hide and to launder money extracted from around the world through the financial and legal systems. The people responsible for this plundering are not the tropical islands lined with palm trees, that we see in popular narrative, but they're mostly in Europe, in North America, and in many developed countries. And so the FSI, the Financial Secrecy Index, is crucial to identify the real commitment of world leaders in the fight of illicit finances and in the stemming of illicit financial flows. So as we've seen, the latest edition shows that the US has climbed to the top of the global ranking, most unfortunately. And so this ranking helps us to actually unpack the narrative, the public narrative, and show how accurate it is for us to mobilize global communities to deal with the real source of the problems. And lastly, I'll just add, because I think I've run out of time, I would say that a global asset registry is a powerful tool to help put a stop to tax abuse from the ultra wealthy. The mechanisms to end such practices are well known. The challenge is not so much about the technicalities and the knowledge, but the political economy and the vested interests of those who benefit at a level of countries, but also at the level of individuals from the continuance of such practices. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. And I think it's a key point, isn't it, about where the secrecy is really coming from and being provided, including by major countries like the US and the countries that suffer the most from it. Now, one interesting element, tomorrow we have the G7 countries finance ministers meeting, and we're optimistic to a point that they may, if not take account of the index directly, at least recognize their own interest in transparency and bring forward some kind of steps towards progress in those countries. But recently it's been the G20 that's been doing a lot of the movement in this area, including giving a mandate to the OECD rather than the United Nations for international tax reforms. So for a country like Argentina, which is not in the G7, but is a member of the G20 and has, substantial influence, it's somewhere in the middle of this process, both suffering the effects of secrecy, but perhaps with some ability to exert influence over the degree of international cooperation. So we have time for questions, and I want to abuse the position of chair to just ask a couple. So I want to go to Moran first, just to check a sense. It feels as if we're at something of a turning point, with the Financial Secrecy Index since 2009, and in more recent years also the Corporate Tax Haven Index. It's been absolutely clear that when you look at objectively verifiable measures of secrecy or corporate tax havenry, you're not looking overwhelmingly at small palmy islands or alpine hideaways. We're talking about some of the major economies in the world being some of the biggest actors. But it feels with this issue of the Financial Secrecy Index that perhaps the Anglo-American dominance is very clear now, with the US at the top, but the UK and its dependent territories a bigger player if they're taken together, and then the G7 as a group going in the wrong direction. Am I kind of picking that up right, Moran? Is your sense that we are really seeing progress around the world, but the biggest economies actually being the ones that are increasingly moving in the wrong direction, or at least failing to make the same kind of progress?
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, I think you're picking the right direction. We do see progress, as I indicated. There is some progress on many aspects on beneficial ownership and country by country reporting. Mati mentioned there that there are some low income countries that already have like beneficial ownership registry, for example, that are public, like Ghana, or Argentina has one with that the definition of beneficial ownership is going from obligation to register even a person with only one share. We don't see that as much as we would like to see that in developed countries. So we do see improvements, but the pace is really slow, and things are happening around the world, as we've just seen with the recent Pandora leaks and with the sanctions that applied on oligarchs, and no one found their could put the hands on their assets. So we need to push for much more, especially from those developed countries in which the most financial services are seen in a large scale, to take action on that, to lead that. So the US, for example, has done quite a large step forward by enacting the Transparency Act, but we could have, we wished for a much more than the way the legislation was drafted. So we would like for also from developing countries, and especially from EU countries, that the EU has led a lot of the transparency initiatives in the last years, to take more lead on to stop this tax abuse, and to impose transparency measures much more than they are at the moment.
Thanks, Moran. So let me turn the question, particularly of the role of the United States, to Carla Mera, if I can. You know, you've spoken about the importance of curbing financial secrecy for your work, but I wonder realistically what Ecuador can do if one of the major obstacles, the major providers of secrecy that affects it, is a superpower, is the United States. Is there a sense that progress is being made? For example, is this administration more willing to engage, to be transparent than the previous one? Or is it really a conversation that isn't happening even with the Biden administration?
Muchísimas gracias por la pregunta. La vamos a tomar como si fuera una pregunta a la UAFE. En realidad, dentro de las cooperaciones internacionales, la Unidad de Análisis Financiero se encuentra trabajando muy de la mano con muchos organismos internacionales, y muchos de ellos de Estados Unidos, con quienes tenemos una muy buena relación. Existe un intercambio de información muy fluida, y hemos recibido este intercambio de información de agencias internacionales como el FBI, como el Departamento de Justicia. De hecho, trabajamos muy de la mano con la Embajada Británica, quien nos ha invitado a esta reunión, y también con el Departamento de INL de la Embajada de Estados Unidos. Por otro lado, nosotros hacemos uso e intercambio de información a través de la plataforma Egmont, en donde se hace un intercambio muy fluido de información. Realmente para una WIF, como una unidad de inteligencia financiera, tener estos organismos o estos departamentos de investigación de nuestro lado nos ayuda mucho a contribuir con la justicia aquí en el Ecuador. Se ha hecho mucho dentro de la judicialización de los procesos que la UAFE ha llevado adelante. Entonces, dentro de ese sentido, nosotros como institución, como organización, sentimos el apoyo de estos organismos de investigación, básicamente. Eso es lo que podríamos decir, lo que vivimos dentro de la Unidad de Análisis Financiero.
Gracias. Well, I mean, it's very interesting to hear that, you know, while at one level, you know, we see, for example, the United States refusing to engage in the automatic exchange of information about financial accounts, that at a practical level, there is a degree of support and even information exchange. So perhaps we should be more optimistic on this. But let me ask both Irene and Matty your views on this. I think we're in a position where we've only really seen the European Parliament discuss the possibility of countermeasures against the United States in the context of its failure to provide information exchange. Now, we know that the United States, when they brought forward FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, effectively used the threat of shutting out financial institutions from other countries if they didn't cooperate in providing information exchange in one direction only to the United States. And so the suggestion that's been discussed at the European Parliament is whether, in effect, the EU is the only bloc that is big enough that it has the power to make that kind of threat on financial institutions from the United States. But politically, it feels as if the European Union member states probably aren't in a position where they could make that threat. So do we get left in a position where, in a sense, as the world moves forward to some extent with transparency, the United States is increasingly, you know, it continues the pattern that we've seen in the index this year of becoming a bigger and bigger financial secrecy center because no one else can stop it, and perhaps it won't stop itself? Or should we be more optimistic? Irene, can I ask you first?
Well, the reality is that achieving reform is very much tied up with the political economy of countries. You know, the power and the power dynamics within countries, so the power that countries have, and the kind of pressures that they can be subjected to, either by other countries or internally by groups within them. So there's an issue around vested interests and what powers can be brought to bear or leveraged to push for reform. For certainly, different administrations have different perspectives or positions on this, and I would say that with the US, that while the ranking has declined in that overall, it is there's a step back in progress in the US. With the new administration, there are opportunities, and I think our colleague from Ecuador has talked about some of those. The other thing is that you will have measures or positions that are evident at a technical level, and then different. There may be a difference at a political level. With the US, I think recent progress that has been made to ban anonymously owned companies, including shell companies, often used as fronts for dirty money, is a good step. You know, and the steps to create a register of beneficial ownership by asking corporations to provide beneficial ownership information is also some progress. But overall, as we found with the FACTI report, we are dealing with a very systemic issue, and looking at the reforms needs to be taken very broadly, very holistically. So ultimately, international cooperation is important for this. Now, the EU that you mentioned has also played a role in this, but to a large extent, many of the progress, much of the progress from the EU is available much more to developed economies or to EU members, but not necessarily in the same way or to the same extent to non-EU member countries. And some of the challenges around that are evident from the index. You know, that within the EU you have a number of tax havens, and some of these are found within leading members of the EU, you know, members of the G7. So there is a political challenge there around progress and around separating interests either at a national level or of powerful groups like multinational corporations within a country from the position taken by that government towards reform. This is why overall, what we have been calling for, not only at ICRIT, but generally the tax justice community and developing countries, G77, the Africa Group, and so on, have been calling for solutions for reform to be shifted to the UN, because that is the forum where majority of countries of the world are present, and where the rulemaking, the basis for rulemaking is clear. You know, where countries are there at an equal basis. I mean, when we examine or analyze the kind of measures proposed under the OECD BEPS deal, for example, we see that the deal is very much weighted to and skewed towards increasing taxing rights for the advanced economies and members of the OECD, rather than developing countries that overall have much fewer taxing rights vis-a-vis advanced economies. So it's only at the UN and through a UN tax convention that we believe it will be possible to achieve fairness. All these different individual measures are not sufficient to deal with a very systemic problem around financial secrecy.
Thanks, Irene. I mean, perhaps that leads to a question for Matti. You know, we've said that the G7 finance ministers are meeting tomorrow, and they have a very clear interest right now, especially in taking steps forward in financial transparency. They have this kleptocracy task force established to track down the assets of Russian oligarchs. And yet, as the index shows, these countries themselves are responsible for a lot of the secrecy that prevents progress, even their own progress. And of course, you know, we know that they dominate decision-making at the OECD and the Financial Action Task Force. Now, you know, Logan Wart, the head of the African Tax Administrators Forum, has complained publicly about the G7 dominating the tax decisions at the OECD. The former long-standing head of the Financial Action Task Force has talked about how that small set of countries manipulates the FATF and prevents greater progress being made there. So where are we on this? Do we throw our hands up in the air and say, you know, these countries will never let us move forward and they are the problem, in a sense? Or do we think, as you know, Irene has suggested, that there is a way of shifting this, shifting it out of these kind of rich country dominated clubs into a more inclusive framework? Or will the same countries prevent even that progress being made?
Thanks, Alex. I think we're not throwing our hands up in the air. There are places where actually the developing country, the G77, the majority of countries, have played a crucial role in tackling illicit financial flows already at the UN, in passing at the UN Tax Committee the article amendment on the double tax treaty, model UN double tax treaty, that would prevent certain types of illicit financial flows from the sales of assets that take place in offshore jurisdictions, to capture the capital gains taxes that can run into hundreds of millions of dollars when you sell a mine or a telecom company or another asset. So there's already progress, and they voted down the OECD countries who actually are in a minority at the UN Tax Committee. Now, the problem is the UN Tax Committee is an expert committee where they act in individual capacity rather than being political representatives of their countries' regions. And therefore, they can't make decisions too far from their expert mandate. And I think that's where we are at the very current moment. Now, very good that Irene is here, because she was on the FACTI panel that said that we should evolve that UN Tax Committee into making a better intergovernmental body where all of these decisions could be possibly either voted or could be made under negotiated outcomes, where you have to respect the voices of all countries. And therefore, the UN negotiating blocks, whether they are the least developed countries, the small island developing states, would have a greater voice, because you have to hear them in a UN table. That would be much better. Now, the reason why the US is not on the FATF list or the EU list or the OECD list is that the US is at the moment too powerful to be put on such a list. No one wants to sanction US banks because they are the biggest systemic banks in the world. And And that's why the EU doesn't want to do that. I'm very glad the European Parliament is suggesting tougher action. And I think one way of looking at the European Parliament's role is that they should work together with African parliamentarians and together with Latin American parliamentarians and create an interparliamentary forum to tackle illicit financial flows globally. There's already parliamentarian networks on IFFs. There's parliamentary committees in many African countries that come together. AFPNet, the African IFF parliamentarian network. Parliamentarians in Latin America meet on these issues and push their governments. And in the global north, the parliaments at the US Democracy Summit in last December came together, US, UK, EU, to talk about these in a parliamentary forum. We need to get action from parliamentarians because they ultimately represent people, and they are possibly less involved in some of the vested interests that currently keep the system so that the US states of South Dakota can get away with this. And let's be honest, it is the small states that are held by, a vested interest that create the most secrecy, and they host these very secretive industries because they can. Yeah.
Thanks, Matti. Look, I'm put in mind that today I haven't mentioned this because we haven't yet had confirmation of it, but today the African Union Economic Commission for Africa ministerial meeting in Dakar in Senegal was deciding on a resolution which makes a call for the beginning of negotiations on a UN tax convention to move these issues into that broader UN forum. So, as I say, that will have happened by now, but I haven't had confirmation that it has happened. We're optimistic that that's a key step on the way to join, as you've mentioned, the positions that the G77 group and the Africa group have taken already at the UN in calling for an intergovernmental body. On the subject of America, I should just advertise that in approximately 45 minutes, the United States launch of the Financial Secrecy Index will be taking place, hosted by our good partners at the FACT Coalition, and with a congresswoman as one of the speakers talking about the political steps that the US is taking. And I think in the United States too, you see parliamentarians engaging in exactly the way you've suggested, Matti, in a way perhaps that goes beyond what their governments are able to do at a given point, but could usefully be joined up. I want to look to this question of the global asset register and perhaps go back to Moran first on this. So Moran, we've talked about the importance of beneficial ownership, and in particular, throughout a whole set of elements of the Financial Secrecy Index, you and the team have looked at the beneficial ownership transparency of different types of legal vehicles and how that interacts internationally. The global asset register that Irene has talked about goes beyond that. It's about joining those up. Is that a pipe dream, or are we starting to get to the point where there is enough of this information being centrally collected that you could sketch out a meaningful skeleton structure that would allow us to actually make a major step forward against anonymous wealth globally?
Thanks. I think as a first step, before even the global registry will be set up, I think that there are several steps we can take on beneficial ownership registries of legal vehicles like trust and companies and limited partnerships and foundations. So we need to definitely make these registries public so that more journalists and civil societies and other people can look at them and can hold the authorities to account. Once these are public, they can also be interconnected within the countries themselves. We need to apply verification measures to make these registries better and more enforced, as we heard now that there is a problem. And we hope that also once now the FATF recommendation 24 has passed, that the recommendation 25 on trust will be discussed, and trust will be also there will be an obligation to register trust, and the information will be accessible to the whole public and not only to those with a legitimate interest. Now, we have also in the Financial Secrecy Index looked into the registry of real estate and free ports. We haven't seen a significant improvement from the last edition that we can identify with, but I think with the unfortunate sanctions imposed on oligarchs at the moment, maybe that will raise more countries to do something about it when they realize that they actually, with the financial secrecy, tied their own hands not to be able to identify those assets. And I think it's just a natural step forward, because in the past, the registries held mainly assets like real estates and land, but this was the past. And now I think more than half of the wealth around the world is financial wealth. So we have to move forward and set up these global registry assets that countries can link in and put their hands on the millions that are held offshore.
Thanks, Moran. So let me go back to Ramon Armas, who is not Carla Mera, sorry, Ramon, but works with Senora Mera in the Financial and Economic Analysis Unit in Ecuador. Can I ask you, Ramon, thinking about, you know, in your role there, the practicalities of starting to put together different registers of beneficial ownership so that, in a sense, they talk to each other, even at the national level, and then thinking across borders, whether from your perspective that feels you know, a path that Ecuador is on, or it perhaps seems kind of too far to the horizon at the moment. Is this something that, you know, that practically makes sense, joining up that beneficial ownership information in that way?
Muchísimas gracias por la pregunta. Dentro de los organismos internacionales a los cuales las WIPs pertenecemos, se encuentra la red de Gafilat, se encuentra, como ya lo dijimos antes, la red de Egmont. Estos organismos internacionales tienen divisiones en las cuales, por ejemplo, se encuentra la red, la RAD, que es la División para Recuperación de Activos, conformado por el mismo Gafilat. Existen cooperaciones internacionales con los organismos multilaterales. Dentro de este campo global se trata y se establece dentro de las recomendaciones del GAFI que las WIF mantengan este intercambio de información y podamos hacer este intercambio de información, entregar y recibir. Es un trabajo que todavía tiene mucho camino por delante, pero que se ha caminado mucho. Vuelvo y repito, estos organismos internacionales nos ayudan a canalizar mejor la información y a transparentar la información internacional. Tenemos casos, obviamente son casos que no se pueden tratar de manera pública, que no es una institución de inteligencia financiera, pero tenemos muchísima cooperación en ese sentido. Puntualmente, con la pregunta que nos acabas de decir, sí existe esta iniciativa, existe esta apertura, pero existen todavía canales que deben abrirse. Ha habido mucho camino que ya se ha abierto, ha habido mucho progreso, sin embargo, podemos nosotros todavía implementar. Por ejemplo, dentro del Ecuador tenemos canales abiertos como es el tema de beneficiario final. tenemos información abierta en la que cualquier usuario, cualquier persona puede ingresar a la Superintendencia de Compañías, a su página de la Superintendencia de Compañías del Ecuador, simplemente con el nombre o con la cédula, el registro, el número de registro de la compañía, se puede ver de manera abierta cómo se encuentran, cuáles son los socios, cuáles son los integrantes de las diferentes firmas o con quién están asociados, y de esa manera se pueden descubrir redes muy complicadas. Tenemos catastros de nuestro SRI, nuestro sistema de rentas internas. También son fuentes abiertas. Estamos tratando de abrir muchos más campos de catastros públicos enfocados en beneficiario final. Esto es una de las recomendaciones del GAFI que se están aplicando aquí en el Ecuador, y creo que se ha hecho mucho énfasis en toda la región. Básicamente eso es lo que les podría decir por el momento. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias. And it's very interesting to hear, you know, the ability, in a sense, to start thinking about that, and the amount of information that is there. Gives me a sense of optimism almost. But I'm aware of the time, so I'll just quickly ask each of the panelists for their closing thoughts, and then we better close this session. But perhaps Ramon, if I can ask you first, just any final reflections on perhaps where we go from here in terms of greater transparency.
Muchísimas gracias, y bueno, primero nos disculpamos por la participación de nuestra directora general. Tiene un día muy ocupado, realmente fue de improviso todo lo que le pasaba en la mañana. Pero nosotros desde el Ecuador podemos decir que en la unidad de análisis financiero busca siempre fortalecer las redes de intercambio de información. Para nosotros es muy importante trabajar a nivel nacional y a nivel internacional con todos los organismos internacionales para poder obtener estas fuentes de información que alimentan a una web, a una unidad de inteligencia. Identificar qué información puede ser compartida y en qué tiempo lo podemos hacer por todos los países, y pertenecer a esta red para nosotros es muy importante. Creo que esa sería nuestro cierre. Muchísimas gracias.
A usted y a señora Mera también. Gracias. Let me ask Irene for your closing thoughts on this. Are we right to see this as a year of opportunity? Which way are we going?
Right, thank you. Well, first I'll just say that this is really an important issue for everyone. It is complex, both technically and politically, but the ramifications of not engaging affect everyone. It affects countries. It creates inequality between countries, and it also affects individuals. So the majorities in the world benefit if there is progress on this issue. And so I would just urge that all individuals, social movements, civic actors, parliaments, as Matti has mentioned, and executives, governments engage on this. Ultimately, it's just the 1%, who benefit from the status quo. So the majority, there is a lot to be gained and a lot to be lost if we do not engage on this matter. Ultimately, at FACTI, we saw this, and at ICRIT, we see this as an issue that is systemic. It is global. It requires cooperation, and it requires action at national levels, as we've heard from various colleagues, and also at a regional and an international level. So the word for me really is around organizing. So we need to move from agonizing to organizing. I think there are a lot of opportunities, and with more focus on this at the multiple levels, by both the technical experts, but also by social movements and by representatives of the people and governments, we can achieve change. So I would like us to live optimistically and know that there are tools that are available, such as the index, that can be used, and we can bring together, build a large global coalitions that build the necessary political power to create pressure on those who benefit from the status quo to accept the need for reform and the need for change.
Thank you, Irene. Matty, from the Financial Transparency Coalition, how do you see the year? Are we on the road?
I think this year will be a very difficult year for many people across the world, with both continued impacts of COVID and new rising inflation due to aspects of the war in Ukraine, raising food and energy prices. It's increasingly urgent to do something about the lost revenues that every state suffers from. And I think there's now if you like, a joint interest between countries who are suffering from the impacts, the economic crisis that is hitting on food and energy prices, that is causing people to fall into poverty and hunger, to raise more money to help their people. Once again, we need a bigger package than we had during COVID, and it can be found if we tackle these secrecy havens. And at the same time, in the global north, the Russian sanctions are creating momentum because it has caused a war, these hidden assets, and a war that is very costly to also European citizens and European governments in sanctions, and making sure that, you know, some of the aspects of rising food prices and inflation are also protecting European citizens from that. I think the momentum couldn't be greater, and we are really now testing political systems and their will to do something about this. And we will be exposing those who are causing this, and we will be calling for action ever more. And let's hope for the best.
Thanks, Matty. Well, exposing those causing the problem, I think, is what the Financial Secrecy Index is all about. So let me turn lastly to Miran Harari, our Interim Director for Financial Secrecy, who has led the creation of the Financial Secrecy Index 2022. Miran, your last thoughts.
So I continue what Matty has just said about the momentum and the need, the collective need to find those resources that we have just lost even more in the last 2 years with the pandemic. So with the launch of the Financial Secrecy today, I think we have indicated and on what exactly are the steps, that the most urgent steps that country needs to take. Tomorrow, the G7 countries are convening to discuss, and I think this is a really important momentum to call for the global asset registry that will help us to find, hopefully, those resources. And what you mentioned, Alex, about the UN Tax Convention, hopefully that is another momentum to call for a UN Tax Convention that will eventually happen. We have been calling it for quite a while, but I hope this time we'll make it there.
Thanks, Miran, and to you and the team for all the work on the index. I know it's an enormous amount of work to cover every country and jurisdiction in such detail. But for everyone else, you know, there's a wealth of data there, infographics, visualizations, all sorts of tools about the vulnerability of different countries to financial secrecy, whether that's through commodity trade or portfolio investment, banking relationships, direct investment, and so on. All of that data is there to play with. fsi.taxjustice.net is your direction. Two last things to close with. The index, you know, in financial secrecy, if you like, is about impunity. It's about allowing people not to make their social contribution through tax or through abiding by the laws that everyone else does. The Financial Secrecy Index is partly a tool to end the impunity of the jurisdictions, like the United States, now ranked #1, like the G7, responsible for halving the amount of progress that's been made, the jurisdictions that are responsible for all of that damage internationally too. Please do use it. Fight impunity with the index. And lastly, please do join us for the next event in this series, which is called Ending Lawless Wealth Towards a Global Asset Registry. And that's in 2 weeks' time on the 31st of May. And we will certainly be picking up these themes. For now, from me, from the Tax Justice Network, thank you very much. Thank you to Helena and Luke and everyone in the team who worked on this behind the scenes who you haven't seen. And thank you for putting up with me in front of it, because our internationally famous moderator was ill, but we hope to have her for a later event. And with that, we'll close. Thank you. Good day.
Thank you so much.